All right, so you know how we love to dig into these articles about, well, let's just say unique personalities.
Oh, absolutely. The more unconventional, the better, right?
Exactly. And this Rokas Eltermanas, the guys in this article, he's like, the definition of unique. Charismatic tornado, they called him. But that kind of feels like an understatement. What do you think? First impressions.
It's funny you should put it that way, because I was thinking the same thing, charismatic tornado. More like a Category 5 hurricane of personality, honestly.
Right. Like, you read this article, and on one hand, you're blown away by this guy. His creativity, the things he's accomplished. It's kind of inspiring in a weird way.
Oh, absolutely. It's impossible to deny that he's brilliant, and he's clearly achieved a lot in his fields.
But then there's the other side of the coin. Like, the way he goes about things. I mean, the guy seems to thrive on chaos.
Well, that's what makes him so fascinating to dissect, right? Because he really does seem to walk this line between genius and, well, let's just say questionable behavior.
Oh, totally. Like, take that story about him mocking the audience at that art exhibition while he was the keynote speaker. Who does that?
It's almost like he's allergic to being conventional, even when it's in his best interest to play the part.
Right. Like, you'd think someone in his position, someone who's built a career on pushing boundaries, would at least pretend to be a little more respectful, especially in that setting. But nope, not Rokas. He just can't help himself.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is this intentional? Is he being deliberately provocative to cultivate this image of himself as a disruptor? Or is he really just wired differently?
I'm kind of leaning towards a bit of both. Like, you don't achieve the level of success he has without a certain degree of calculation. He has to know what he's doing, at least to some extent.
I agree. He's clearly very intelligent, very strategic. But at the same time, there's a certain authenticity to his unconventionality that's hard to fake.
That's a good point. It's like he's not just trying to be shocking for the sake of it. There's a method to the madness, even if it's not always clear what that method is.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the people around him, right? His colleagues, his employees, even his family and friends. How do they deal with this constant whirlwind of, well, Rokas?
Well, that's what we're here to unpack.
Exactly. Let's dive in.
I mean, you have to wonder what it's like to work with a guy like this,
Yeah.
day in and day out. He seems like he'd be a lot to handle.
Oh, absolutely. And the article doesn't shy away from that aspect of his personality either. Remember that story about the team building exercise where he shared that, shall we say, unflattering honeymoon photo of Margitos?
Oh my God, yes. I had almost blocked that out of my memory. Like, who does that?
Right. And it's presented in the article as this funny anecdote, this example of his unconventional leadership style. But it makes you wonder about the power dynamics at play, you know?
Exactly. Like, how do you say no to a guy like that? Especially if he's your boss.
Exactly. And even if you're thinking, okay, maybe he just has a weird sense of humor, then you get to that story about Ramonte and the whole performance feedback circle incident.
Oh God, yes. That was rough. Publicly humiliating an employee over their clothing choices? I don't care how creative your work environment is. That's just not okay.
It's a perfect example of where that line between eccentricity and just plain bad behavior gets blurred.
Totally. And it makes you question, like, is this guy actually a good leader? Or is he just good at getting away with this stuff because he's got that charisma shield?
Right. Like, does the success excuse the behavior? It's a tricky one.
For sure. And it's not just his leadership style that's, shall we say, unconventional. His whole approach to creativity seems to be built on pushing himself and everyone around him to their absolute limits. Remember that part about hard work tantra? I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one.
Oh, yeah. The plank poses while reciting poetry. It's like something out of a satire about the tech industry.
Seriously. And the sleep deprivation, the ultra-marathon running. It's like he's trying to turn burnout into an art form.
It's definitely a different approach, that's for sure. And I think it speaks to this larger trend we're seeing, especially in certain industries, where there's this glorification of overworking, of pushing yourself to the point of exhaustion in the pursuit of, greatness or whatever.
Cool. It's like the hustle culture on steroids.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, is it sustainable?
Right. Like, how long can you keep that up before you completely burn out?
Exactly. And at what cost? I mean, this guy's personal life must be a mess.
You would think so. But then again, maybe that's all part of his plan, right? Fueling his creativity with chaos.
Maybe. Or maybe he's just really good at compartmentalizing. Who knows?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's for sure, the guy gets results. Or at least that's what the article would have us believe.
Right. Opened Lithuania to LinkedIn, saved ad campaigns at the 11th hour. It's an impressive resume, no doubt.
It really is. But I have to admit, I'm still a little skeptical about some of it. Like that whole thing about advising a cult leader, that just seems too crazy to be true even for Rokas.
I know, right? It's like, at what point does the line between reality and self-mythologizing become completely blurred? Is he deliberately exaggerating his achievements, or does he actually believe these things?
It's impossible to know for sure, which I guess is part of what makes him so intriguing.
Exactly. He's a walking enigma, this guy. A puzzle wrapped in a riddle inside a, well, you get the idea.
Definitely. So how do we even begin to make sense of a guy like Rokas Eltermanas? Is he a creative genius, a master manipulator, a force of nature?
All of the above. None of the above. I think that's the question we're left grappling with. And honestly, I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
Maybe that's the point, you know? Maybe he wants us to be confused, to question everything.
Oh, totally. It's like he's playing a game with us, and he's always one step ahead.
Right. It's all part of the persona. Which brings us back to that talk title, the one that was mentioned in the article, Extermination of Office Bloodsuckers. I mean, come on. What are we supposed to make of that?
I know, right? Is he being serious? Is it satire? Performance art? A really elaborate LinkedIn baiting scheme? It's impossible to tell.
That's Rokas for you, I guess. Always keeping us guessing. But on a more serious note, what do you make of that kind of language, especially in a professional context?
Well, it's definitely provocative, and you could even argue that it's a little bit dangerous, especially given his position of power.
For sure. There's a fine line between being a disruptor and just being, well, kind of a jerk.
Absolutely. And it's up to each individual to decide where they draw that line. What might be inspiring or motivating to one person could be completely off-putting or even harmful to another.
That's a good point. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here. But I think that's what makes this whole conversation so interesting. Rokas Eltermanas forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the kind of leaders we're willing to follow, the kind of work environments we're willing to tolerate, even the kind of creativity we're willing to aspire to.
Exactly. He's like a walking, talking Rorschach test. We all see something different in him based on our own experiences, our own values, even our own insecurities.
So where does that leave us? Is Rokas Eltermanas a force for good or evil? A visionary or a villain?
I honestly don't think it's that simple, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the real value in exploring a figure like this isn't about coming to a definitive conclusion, but about asking ourselves the tough questions, challenging our assumptions, and maybe even learning a little bit about ourselves along the way.
I think you nailed it. It's about the journey, not the destination. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. As always, it's been a wild ride.
For sure. But hey, that's what happens when you spend an hour dissecting the life and times of Rokas Eltermanas, the human tornado.
Touché. Until next time, folks, keep those articles coming. And remember, sometimes the most fascinating personalities are also the most perplexing.